chair. And I will ask you for your help with this. MA, do you want to say that for me?
Yeah, it's Nibe Minawaki Nakanagewan.
Oh, that's beautiful. With Indigenous governments in relation with land and water. And then we have Dr. Lauren Touchon, who is joining us live from Glasgow. Lauren is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center on Governments at the University of Ottawa. And then finally, we have Ralph Pentland, board member of the Forum for Leadership on Water, or FLOW, and director of water planning and management in the Canadian federal government. Okay, so we have everyone here, I believe. So today we're talking about the Canada Water Agency on a global context, but what we want to do quickly is kind of look over what the Canada Water Agency is. So the proposed Canada Water Agency is optimally going to be an agency that looks over fresh water in Canada and addresses a lot of the fragmentation difficulties and issues that Canada is currently facing. So some of the things we're going to talk about and mention today and go into detail are issues around reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, knowledge creation and mobilization, cooperative federalism, and a watershed approach, as well as deep reform in how water is managed in Canada. And this also includes transboundary issues in Canada as well. So why this is really important at this moment in time is that water was officially recognized by all parties in the recent 2021 federal election and was actually distinctly mentioned in each platform of the major parties, which is a huge achievement and really shows that there is a lot of engagement around protecting water in Canada in some way or another. In addition to that, the creation of the Canada Water Agency was specifically mentioned in the Liberal platform, and the Liberal Party did go on to win in a minority government in the Canadian election. So what we know so far about the proposed Canada Water Agency is very little. We don't know who or what will run it, but what we do know is that there has been a $17 million budget allocated through the 2021 federal budget. So we do know or hope, knock on wood, that it will be created by the end of 2022. So that's kind of where we're coming from with everything going on right now. And it's what we're going to be discussing today is why do we need the Canada Water Agency? What problems will it fix and will it address? And what is the purpose of this from a governance, law, policy, and societal perspective? And the last question we'll ask today is, what is the global need for this and what kind of influence could a Canada Water Agency have globally? So with that in mind, we're going to start. So the very first question I want to ask our amazing panel today is, why do we need a Canada Water Agency now? So I want to direct that first to Dr. John Pomeroy.
Thank you very much, Emily. The fact we're having this panel discussion at COP26 relates to my answer. The tremendous driver that rapid and destructive climate change and extreme events are having on Canada, which causes us to change how we adapt and manage these events. And creates the need for the Canada Water Agency. What climate warming has meant for Canada is a dramatic increase in our flood damages across the country, which are now passing $30 billion just in the last few years. And the increase in droughts to unprecedented droughts and fires and water supply shortages, even resulting in the shutdown of irrigation in part of southern Alberta this summer. So we're seeing the collapse of our glaciers, the demise of our snowpack across the country, the loss of our frozen lakes and rivers. We are seeing shifts in our hydrological regimes, which make water management difficult, if not impossible, in many areas. Degradation of our water quality due to warmer climate, causing nutrient runoff, eutrophication of lakes, and fish kills and other ecosystem shifts associated with this, and it really challenges our whole society. And of course, we have had historically this tremendously fragmented approach, so it's not viable anymore. And climate change has really pushed us to the brink where we have a water crisis in Canada. The rest of the world will hardly want to believe that. Canada has a water crisis. If you have a water crisis, everyone has a water crisis. Well, yes, everyone does have a water crisis, but ours is particularly severe and one that we need to address now with the coordination that a Canada Water Agency can provide.
Thank you so much. And I'll send the same question to you, Corinne. Why do we need this now from your perspective?
Thanks, Emily. It's a pleasure to be joining you from Saskatchewan today in Treaty 6 territory and traditional homeland of the Métis. And to answer your question and to follow on from John, we need the Water Agency now in order to take leadership, not only focused on the hydroecological system, but linked to the social dimensions of water-related climate change events. And so, as John mentioned, floods, droughts, associated wildfires, mudslides, but we also have more broadly local water insecurity and water-related diseases. And so coordination is needed because these events are impacting the health and well-being of people living in Canada through physical and mental health impacts, loss of property and sense of self and belonging, loss of livelihoods, loss of social and physical infrastructure. And so leadership is required to fill knowledge gaps, to consolidate knowledge and experiences, to share evidence-based solutions, and it's all in order to reduce vulnerability, enhance resilience, and reduce the future adverse water-related impacts on people living in Canada.
Thank you. And again, same question to you, MA.
I think, well, first of all, thank you for creating this opportunity. And I'm joining you from Treaty 1 territory in Manitoba. And, we have an opportunity in front of us to correct some past wrongs through a Canada Water Agency. And colleagues are going to talk about the need on climate change and how the management and governance of water has been fragmented in Canada. And I think we all deeply understand that water doesn't have boundaries, and we need to correct some of these jurisdictional silos. And, those silos exist in terms of who decides, what regions are being decided upon, and what are the principles of decision-making. And all three of those have really excluded Indigenous people from those conversations and from that water governance. And this is an opportunity for Canada to think about how to bring into an era of reconciliation the direct involvement of Indigenous people who are responsible for lands and waters. And there's an imperative to remedy those broken relationships, to start to work in nation-to-nation formats, which the federal government has promised, and kind of import that into one of the most critical issues that we face collectively in Canada, and that has a significant impact on Indigenous people, which is water. Even though the idea of clean drinking water has been excluded from the proposed mandate of the Canada Water Agency, I think all water issues have this deep connection and spiritual connection into Indigenous communities, and therefore bringing that into part of how we frame a water future collectively is incredibly significant.
Thank you. Yes, I think that it's the perfect time to talk about this. I think the whole nation of Canada, and I would hope that the world is really starting to discuss the role that Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous actual governance really takes on these natural resources. And Lauren, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, perfect, Lauren. Thank you. So, Lauren, I do want to send that. Oh, perfect. Hi, welcome from Glasgow.
Thank you.
So, Lauren, why do we need the Canada Water Agency now?
There are significant gaps in the current water governance and management. One of the priority would be to solve and address the funding that we provide, the federal government provides for infrastructure. So if we look at the past few years, the federal government has decreased the funding towards infrastructure, whereas we all know that infrastructure are actually aging quite fast. There is an impact also with infrastructure because we're not able to access drinkable water in some areas of Canada. I'm thinking of Collingwood right now. The water levels are going down, are dropping, and they need to extend the pipe to be able to take the water and provide drinkable water to their community. Invasive species have been also an issue. The zebra mussel have been clogging pipes. So municipalities definitely need to adapt, but to do this, they need funding. Laws and policies must be modernized. Canada desperately needs a strategy, and this strategy needs to include data and information sharing. Information is not really available on time, and it's even costly to municipalities and community who manage the infrastructure. We desperately need to centralize the information and have an access point for municipalities to be able to ask questions. There is a significant fragmentation of policy instruments. We see actually an overlap, a lack of collaboration, as well as a lack of coordination. And the Canada Water Agency has an opportunity really to support collaborative work already happening, but to really align funding with local priorities.
Thank you, Lauren. And lastly, Ralph, can you kind of tell us why we need a Canada Water Agency right now?
I'll just elaborate a bit following on Lauren's remarks on why the urgency of dealing with fragmentation within the federal government itself. Freshwater plays some role in virtually every aspect of the lives of Canadians, their health, their wealth, their well-being. So it shouldn't be surprising that there are water programs in over 20 departments in the federal government. That's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. But what is not good is policy incompatibilities and program inefficiencies, which a new agency might overcome. In 2017, I participated in the work of a blue ribbon panel made up of specialists from across Canada and from several other countries. That panel examined several water programs in Environment and Climate Change Canada. It concluded that federal program fragmentation is a major impediment to addressing Canada's national freshwater issues. It went on to say that fragmentation is reducing not only effectiveness of federal programs, but it's also impacting negatively on the effectiveness of relations with other orders of government, with other sectors of the Canadian water sector. Over the years, reports by the IPC and other international organizations have consistently stressed the need for program consistency in dealing with climate change. Here's one typical quote. Response strategies in one sector or activity should not run counter to adaptation strategies in other sectors or activities. Similarly, adaptation strategies should not defeat or negate limitation strategies or their objectives. Another consistent message in international reports is that even though most climate change adaptation will take place at subnational levels, much of the supporting information generation, technology transfer, and options analysis will necessarily have to take place at national, binational, and multinational levels. This will require strengthening, and in some cases, establishment of new, more integrated institutions capable of the necessary consensus building. That's where the Canada Water Agency comes in. Better aligned federal policies, laws, and programming will also better accommodate overlapping jurisdictions and encourage improved intergovernmental cooperation. It's expected that Canada Water Agency leadership will result in new and modernized agreements dealing with, for example, flood damage reduction, flood forecasting, drought forecasting, infrastructure programs at municipal level, climate change adaptation in the municipal agriculture and other sectors, and as well as co-governance arrangements with Indigenous government bodies. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph. So for the next part of this discussion, what we're going to do is actually speak individually with each of our panel members and talk about these different aspects that were all mentioned. As you can tell, there are a lot of reasons of why we need the Canada Water Agency now. So we're really going to dive into why that is. So my first question to you is to John. And what I want to ask you is, can you go into the pressing hydrological needs for a Canada Water Agency?
Yes, happy to. And thank you. There are a number of them, and they relate to some of the stressors that have been brought up here. One is that Canada is the only G7 country without a national flood forecasting system. So this seems bizarre in that we have tremendous increases in our flood damages across the country. We've had major cities like Calgary, Alberta, had to evacuate with very little notice in the last decade. Others, even less, Fort McMurray and Ottawa and Montreal. We've had major floods in Toronto, New Brunswick, and where's our National Flood Forecasting Agency? This has been left to the provinces to do. And some of the larger, richer provinces do a better job of it, and the smaller provinces and the territories just don't have the resources to do it. And water doesn't care about our provinces. It crosses transboundary waters. And so you'll have a large river, such as the Saskatchewan River system, arises in Alberta, crosses Saskatchewan into Manitoba. A flood in this case would be forecast by 3 different provincial agencies. So we need to work on this cooperatively, bringing the provincial efforts together with federal help by developing the next generation models that can take advantage of high performance computing systems that can predict floods and droughts and water quality episodes and future water supply at the scales and to communicate the uncertainty that Canadians need to design their future. This is critically important. The next area is of water information. We do a fairly good job in the country working federally and provincially through the Water Survey of Canada to bring water quantity information, essentially stream flow and lake levels, together. We don't do the same job with groundwater. Groundwater information is collected provincially or not at all. And there isn't that same ease of access of a central repository that should be made available right along with the stream flow information. And the water quality information, same thing, tremendous fragmentation of this across the country. So we need to bring the glaciers, the groundwater, the water quality, the surface water information all together into a water information network for the country that can support decision making. We have to map floodplains. We used to have a national cooperative floodplain mapping program. We got rid of it, unfortunately, decades ago. We desperately need it now to have high quality floodplain maps and dynamical maps that can change and show the change in extensive flooding as climate change progresses through this century and into the next. This is the essential information that Canadians will require to adapt to climate change and to ensure equitable and reasonable management of water across the country. Finally, we have a tremendous loss of what is called the cryosphere, snow and ice in this country associated with climate change. At the same time, we have minimized our collection of snow information. Our snow surveys and our glacier mass balance surveys are barely hanging on, with where we had 30 people nationally working on this in the federal government several decades ago, we have 3. So we need to reinvest in these observations of our remaining cryosphere to make sure that that is a robust part of this information and prediction network, because the changes we will get from the warming and the loss of our snow and ice, the loss of our permafrost over time will move forward. And then the final thing is that groundwater will become increasingly important as Canada warms up and dries out over the next century. And so bringing together groundwater forecast information for water supplies. Remember, 70% of Canadians rely on groundwater for their drinking is going to be essential. And so we need these coupled models that couple the atmosphere, climate change, snow and ice, surface water, soil moisture for agriculture, and groundwater together with water quality running across the country at scales that can aid Canadians to make the very difficult water management decisions that will be needed over the next century. Thank you.
Thank you, John. It's really great to hear that we're looking at so many different types of water, including groundwater, glacial melt, surface water. I think that's so important. So moving next to Corinne, what I want to ask you is, in what ways or what are the knowledge gaps that the Canada Water Agency can fill other than those that John just mentioned?
Well, as John did say, COVID-19 has dominated headlines for almost 2 years, but floods, droughts, wildfires, melting glaciers, lack of access to drinking water, they've still made the news in Canada. And so it does emphasize that our water resources are under threat and that inequities exist. And so we must support development of early warning systems, as John has indicated, and these need to be in coordination with Indigenous nations, federal, provincial, territorial, municipal, health, social, and environmental entities. And having said this, in addition to the technical modeling and forecasting advances required, we have to ensure that these early warning systems actually are accessible to everyone in a timely manner. And so this really requires a better understanding of who is vulnerable, where they are vulnerable and why they're vulnerable. And we also need to consider cultural and spiritual impacts alongside economic, food, energy, and physical health impacts. There needs to be a better understanding of the different ways in which people in Canada value our water resources so that we can look at how these may change over time and what impact this will have. Another point that we need to consider and that the agency needs to consider is that not everyone is affected in the same way and to the same degree, both by water-related disasters themselves, but also by the experiences of disaster. Some people are more resilient than others on an individual basis. Some people have access to resources that buffer them from impacts to greater or lesser degrees. Some people have more or less autonomy over protecting themselves. And so understanding how these intersecting identities confer privilege or discrimination is critical to understanding how to support enhanced resilience and sustainable adaptation that, in line with the SDGs and to coin the phrase, leaves no one behind. This also supports implementation of the Government of Canada's Gender-Based Analysis Plus assessment, which is a mandate that will fall on the agency, as well as on other federal government ministries. Essentially, GBA Plus is an approach to ensure that differential impacts on people with different identities, such as gender, age, ability, ethnicity, are considered as part of decision-making so that inequities are not perpetuated or exacerbated. It also aligns with Canada's international facing policies, and specifically the Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy. So in order to fill these and other knowledge gaps, for me, the agency needs to be a coordinating hub, not just for climate, hydrometeorological, and water quality data, but for ecological and economic sector data, as well as disaggregated socioeconomic, demographic, and health data. Now, this doesn't mean that all data needs to be housed within the agency. Rather, the agency has connections with, for example, the Public Health Agency of Canada and Statistics Canada to be able to draw data sets together. The agency needs to support enhanced capacity building in modeling, prediction, risk assessment and communication, community engagement, and transdisciplinary water research and data analyses. It needs to coordinate across sectors, ministries, and levels of governments. And again, we've heard a little bit about this in terms of the fragmentation. The agency also needs to recognize and create space for different ways of knowing, the braiding of different knowledge systems, and for Indigenous water governance. So perhaps in addition to the known knowledge gaps that need to be filled, it's a question of the processes by which future knowledge gaps will be identified and filled to reduce inequities, enhance resilience, and move towards shared governance and sustainable management of our water resources. And these are some of the roles that I see for a Canada Water Agency.
Thank you, Corinne. And playing off of the idea that different communities have different vulnerabilities and different resilience to climate change, especially with water, I want to go to M.A. Craft and ask you a slightly large question. In what ways can the Canada Water Agency meaningfully further reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in Canada?
That is a big question. And I think that there's an opportunity through the Canada Water Agency for Canada to be a leader and also to back up some of the statements it's made in respect to reconciliation, with respect to reconciliation in Canada with Indigenous peoples. I'd like to answer maybe in two parts. And the first that I'd like to focus on is the idea of Indigenous involvement in governance. And I think to date in the governance and management of water in Canada, what we've seen is if Indigenous people have been involved, they've been involved primarily sort of on what I would call the back end, or I don't know if it's the back end or front end, but it's on the management pieces, sort of the tinkering around decisions, governance decisions that have been made in ways that exclude Indigenous people from those really critical front end conversations that are about making the big water decisions. And I'll use an example, and it might be a micro example, but when a dam is proposed to be built, the question usually isn't asked of Indigenous people, should the dam be built? It's more the question of how should it be managed and what are some of the mitigation measures that we might include to minimize impact within lands, territories, and on resources within your area. And that kind of excludes Indigenous people from those really core questions, the big governance questions, the questions of jurisdiction and who decides in what ways and in accordance with what principles. And I think that we have this opportunity through the Canada Water Agency to implement reconciliation, nation-to-nation agreements, free, prior, and informed consent, and actually try and craft something where Indigenous people are involved in those big decisions about what should be happening, not just how to manage the decisions that are made that have excluded Indigenous people in the past. So I think that's a really important opportunity here, and a desperately needed one, especially if we're thinking about Canada moving into a land back and water back reconciliation imperative. There's an opportunity for Indigenous people to lead. I think there's also a huge gap in terms of Indigenous knowledges informing how decisions are made and which decisions are made, and looking at Indigenous knowledges not only as ways of validating Western science or legitimizing decisions that are made in those governance systems that exclude Indigenous people, but rather thinking about Indigenous knowledges as ways of thinking about how governance can actually be effective. So helping us understand how to make good decisions from Indigenous perspectives, and then including Indigenous forms of knowledge relating to natural environments within that, but not only sort of pigeonholing Indigenous knowledges as environmental science from an Indigenous perspective, but actually thoughts about how governance can take place and how collaboration can be effective. Indigenous nations have had treaties amongst themselves with other nations for millennia in relation to this territory and these waters. So to think that there's been this exclusion since the creation of Canada is deeply problematic, but this is an opportunity to rectify that and bring those nations and people that have been in connection with water for all that time back into the fold of how those decisions are made.
Thank you. That's incredible. I really appreciate what you're saying about bringing it all in the collaborative moment and bringing everyone on the same speaking level, not putting the front or back end or just kind of the idea of a final conclusionary remark. So I think that's a really important note to stress. And on that, I want to go to Lauren now and ask you, how do we support collaborative governance through the Canada Water Agency, but also ensure that we don't reach certain stalemates that maybe occur when too many voices are happening?
Yeah, thank you for the question. There is actually a lot of willingness from different stakeholders to collaborate. So I don't think there is some sort of barriers. However, what I've heard from stakeholders is the adequate funding. Adequate funding must be allocated to support collaborative initiatives and efforts, and they must also support those initiatives with expertise and particularly capacity building. Let me take a bit of an example. The Land to Lake initiative, located in Western Ontario, is a collaborative that was born a few years ago in 2017, and it brought together conservation authorities, municipalities, the province, the federal government. And initially, this initiative was funded by Environment and Climate Change Canada, and it was also funded by its counterpart at the provincial level. But it ran out of funding at the most critical moment when the momentum for collaboration was actually at its peak. And Environment and Climate Change Canada actually expressed interest to pursue the collaboration, but for 2 years, things were stalling. Conservation authorities and municipalities do not have the financial resources, the human resources required to actually move this initiative forward. And they also lack of expertise. They really want to leverage, for instance, the theory of change. And this was actually a learning curve for them because they didn't know what the theory of change was and how they can use it to foster collaboration to better protect Lake Ontario. So capacity building is definitely critical. The other barrier to overcome is leadership. Leadership is significant. We can have a Canada Water Agency, but if there is no leadership, we're not going to be able to foster collaboration. And a strong collaboration is actually required to steer that ship. It's critical for a systematic approach. We needed to break silos, to build bridges, and slowly erase current administrative boundaries, particularly required to address wicked problems like climate change. It's a very difficult exercise, so we really need the Canada Water Agency here to play a significant role in steering those collaborative approaches to protecting the ecosystem. So the Canada Water Agency can definitely support an outcome-driven, systematic approach to protecting water. But we also need to learn from current initiatives such as the Great Lakes, for instance. So the Great Lakes has created the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Collaborative Commission. It is supported by a federal interdepartmental task force, fostering horizontal collaboration amongst federal departments. On the side, it is informed by the Indigenous Great Lakes and St. Lawrence organization, and everything is oversaw by the Environmental and Sustainable Development Coordinator. So this is a very interesting model. It's newly designed and it hasn't been tested yet. However, municipalities and the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Alliance wrote a recommendation to the federal government as they were consulting for the creation of the Canada Water Agency, and recommended that they implement that new design to manage and better protect the Great Lakes. And lastly, I think very important is the better coordination of research to support collaborative governance. In 2017, it was the year of Lake Ontario. The province was doing research along the shores. The federal government was closer to the international border, and the conservation authorities were working in the watershed, and none of them were talking to one another. So how do we better collaborate? How do we better share data to inform those collaborative approaches to protecting the ecosystem? And the Canada Water Agency here can play a significant role in informing the stakeholders as they work and endorse a systematic approach to protecting the ecosystem. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. So moving forward, what I really want to look at is that we've been talking a lot about what's happening in Canada and why we really need this agency. Now I want to look at what is the global impact that a Canada Water Agency could have. So we're going to enter an open discussion, and I just want to ask the entire panel, what can the Canada Water Agency become globally? What can it be looked at? And why do we want to look at it as an example of leadership in governance and freshwater governance and in resilience? So I'll just open the floor to everyone.
If I can start from here.
Yeah.
I believe that the Canada Water Agency can become a model for potential initiatives abroad. There are countries paying a lot of attention to what is happening in Canada, and in the conversation I had with people here in Glasgow, they are watching the Canada Water Agency and what it's going to do and how it's going to be designed and how it is going to be working with the different levels of governments. The diversity of our provinces and territories, the size actually of our territory, offers an opportunity to pilot initiatives and expand the model abroad. And it's kind of similar to the proposal that was made by Prime Minister Trudeau about the minimum standard for pricing carbon to some extent. Is we can test things here because there is such a level of diversity that could be applicable worldwide. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second one is the Canada Water Agency would be extremely relevant if it has an international research collaboration or some sort of body that would actually collaborate with other countries to pursue research. And lastly, during the NATO summit, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, supported by actually the Prime Minister of Netherlands, proposed to host a Center of Excellence for Climate Security in Canada. And the scope of this agency, I believe, is excluding water security. So I would argue that we need to expand the mandate of this Center of Excellence to include environmental security, particularly water. Canada is facing a water crisis. The world is facing and dealing right now with a water crisis. We've seen the first case of a recognized environmental refugee in France, and we are seeing right now human displacement because of water scarcity. And if you've been following COP, many of the activists and climate activists, in particular particularly Elizabeth Wahuti from Kenya, was talking about 2 million of Kenyan currently starving because it hasn't rained in many months, and they are not expecting rain for another year or so. And the lakes, the rivers, and the creeks are actually right now depleted, and animals and people are actually dying. So lives are not only at risk, but they're in danger right now. So the Center of Excellence can be definitely connected to the Canada Water Agency through an international arm, and it could help and support communities not only in Canada, but throughout the world. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. Yeah, John?
Emily, thank you. I think there are tremendous opportunities for Canada internationally through the Canada Water Agency. Canada One has a proud history of international help and development through the Canadian CEDA, the Canadian International Development Agency. And when we had the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration, they sent their engineers and hydrologists around the world to help with achieving water developments and sustainability in various locations. But there's so much more that we can do. Lauren has touched upon that if you can solve the water problems in Canada with the diverse federal provincial system, with Indigenous water rights, with environments from cold Arctic glaciated or high alpine environments to Great Lakes to semi-arid near deserts and to areas with perennial water shortages, if we can solve our problems internally, then that is a bit of a model that can be taken out to the world. Remember, we are the second largest country on the planet. We have a tremendous area of the land and freshwater mass already. And so that can be a model for how countries can work together in Central Asia or East Africa or in South America to better manage their water resources. But further, the prediction systems, the data systems, the observation systems that I discussed earlier could be applied globally. Canada could be a center for global water prediction and global water solutions by taking the high performance computer models, the hyper resolution models that we're developing for the Canadian context, because we're a bit late to the game, but we're running fast and running hard and developing new things without the legacies of old computational structures. We can take those out globally. They're built to be scalable so that you can operate them, yes, over Western Canada or over South America or over Central Asia. And the experience we've gained with lakes, with high mountains, with deserts, with irrigation, with predicting floods and droughts, with linking these to water quality episodes, and then taking this information for source water protection for rural communities. This could be taken abroad for around the world. And I think there's tremendous interest from organizations such as the World Meteorological Organization and UNESCO and others to see Canada take a lead in this around the world. And so I think it's perfectly fitting that the Canada Water Agency do this, and Canada not only be known as the country with the greatest amount of fresh water per person for a large country, but also be the country that provides solutions for the globe. Thank you.
Yes, Corinne.
Thanks. For me, it's water being a powerful lever for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals domestically and internationally. And so I see the Canada Water Agency, similar to John, being able to advance knowledge and tools, but for managing water from perspectives of environmental integrity, social development and resilience, and economic activity, and so really tying into achieving the SDGs. It can also draw attention to the role of water in equity and gender equity specifically, so SDG 5 around the world. And as I've said, we need to commit to an intersectional approach that considers how power structures influence water management and the resulting water-related inequities and vulnerabilities. And so I agree, Canada can apply what we know about treating and managing water as a vehicle for expanding trade, but using our expanding expertise in water governance and nation-to-nation engagement as a means of fulfilling Canada's international assistance objectives, but within the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Perfect.
I'll
And
add
yes,
to that, Emily, that I think Canada has an opportunity to be a global leader in terms of its implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Canada committed to that notionally, and then passed legislation that said that federal legislation would come into harmony with the principles of UNDRIP. And that starts with self-determination by Indigenous people, institutions of decision-making that are Indigenous, free, prior, and informed consent, and maintaining spiritual and sacred connections to water. So those principles that are found in the United Nations Declaration have to make their way into federal policy and legislation in meaningful ways. And so the Canada Water Agency and any changes to the Canada Water Act would have to align with those core principles. And so Canada has an opportunity to lead in this sense, and to lead through the Canada Water Agency, because I think that the world is watching Canada in terms of how it will implement UNDRIP. Canada has said through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada that UNDRIP is the framework for reconciliation in Canada. So we need to be taking seriously this agency, any changes to policy and legislation in Canada, as an opportunity to navigate towards Indigenous governance and Indigenous knowledges as core and central parts of how we think about our relationships with water, to water in Canada today. And I just want to make a note, it may seem less significant to others, but a lot of Indigenous people are talking in frameworks of relationship with water. And, I think that that's at the core, instead of ideas of controlling, owning, and managing, that we need to think about these relationships with water and what they mean within different territories, and how we preserve those relationships within extended timeframes. And Indigenous knowledge systems and worldviews and Indigenous legal orders have a lot to add to that conversation about helping to create what I referred to earlier as sort of like a collective understanding of how that relationship is going to manifest in ways that build in deep equality and reach international sustainability goals, as some of my colleagues have mentioned already.
Thank you, Emma. Yes, I definitely agree. I think that we are lucky in Canada that we live in a society where a lot of people value water, but I don't think they value water in terms of, they value it much as a resource or something that we have already been born into the privilege of being around quite often. So really bringing Canadians back to like the value that water brings in every capacity, and the relationship that you mentioned with water, I think is going to be a huge part of both the Canada Water Agency and the Canada Water Act, and really renewing that as well. So thank you for that. And thank you, everyone. I actually want to go to Ralph now and just kind of ask you about how this could have a global influence on the private industry side of everything.
Yeah, I think that's another interesting angle. I spent about 10 years doing environmental water resource consulting internationally. And just want to talk about a couple of examples that demonstrate what contribution Canada can make and how the agency might work with the private sector in helping that happen. The first example is a consortium was put together by a large Canadian firm of experts from Canada, Britain, and the United States, and I was part of that, to work with the government of China on a project called Strategic Options for the Water Sector for China. And that was really I think, one of the most fascinating things I did in my whole life. We spent several months working with this committee of senior officials with China, and came up with some really interesting ideas which really interested them. A second example was Environment Canada. Back about 15, 20 years ago, there was a major flood happening in Poland. And Environment Canada organized a group of Canadian experts, which I was part of, which went over to Poland. This included both government and private and public sector. We went over to Poland and advised on flood recovery, and also on policies that they should be thinking about following the flood, because some of their policies were not really, they're not the same as Canadian ones, I'll say. But the point is that there's, I think, a tremendous amount of potential out there in the private sector, but that has to be, it's a risky business, and it needs help and support from the government in some ways. It also needs help from the government to organize and bring these things about. So Canada Water Agency, I think, could play a major role working together with the private sector to bring these Canadian skills and talents around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph. And a question I have for the panel, kind of going off of this, is there tends to be, when we talk about climate change, there's a lot of pessimism. I think especially as everyone on this panel knows, we've been working for a long time, and it can be very frustrating to not see progress. So I want to ask each of you individually, why are you hopeful about the Canada Water Agency on freshwater management in Canada? And if so, why are you hopeful? What is that one thing that's giving you hope to keep driving this forward? So I'll start with Lauren, and then we can just go off.
Yes, I'm going to say I'm hopeful because it's being designed as we speak. There's an opportunity for us to engage with the government, to design the right tools, to create and to design the institution that is going to support systematic approaches, which is going to support truth and reconciliation in collaboration with Indigenous people. So I am hopeful as long as, we have this opportunity to engage with the government. We don't know yet when the agency is going to be created. We just have a new government in place. So let's engage with the government and have this opportunity to influence the future of the Canada Water Agency.
And John, I'm going to send this to you next.
Okay. Yes, I'm hopeful that we'll see a strong, effective Canada Water Agency. I was very impressed that the federal government last year had national consultation on what this agency should be, what dimensions should it have, how should it engage, that they've had discussions with the provinces to deal with the constitutional issues on water between the two, to moving towards a cooperative federalism model, that they've had extensive discussions and engagement with First Nations, with Indigenous communities, because there are unresolved Indigenous rights issues and certainly horrific water quality problems for many Indigenous communities. So there's lots to solve there. So that was a good basis to move forward. But now I think this meeting, the science that's come forward, the global disaster that we're in from climate change, means that it's time for the fast train on the Canada Water Agency, that we can establish this agency very rapidly with the strengths that exist within the federal government by leveraging in with the university community programs such as Global Water Futures, Standby, Ready to Help, to the strengths of the provinces and the First Nations across the country in doing this. And the Canada's in dire need of water solutions provided by the agency to its communities, to its regions, to its provinces, to its river basins. And by doing this now, we can get ahead of the guaranteed problems that we're going to have from climate change over this century and plan to get ahead of them, thereby reducing dramatically the costs and the impacts of climate change on this country and providing, moving towards water sustainability through this century. And of course, that has to be the objective of the Water Agency. We can also use it to start to solve our equity problems across the country, to provide for a more balanced and fair apportionment of water with First Nations, with different regions of the country. And remember that the impacts of climate change on our neighbor to the south, the United States, are going to be very severe as parts of that country become too dry for agriculture or some of the cities in that area. And so our transboundary relationships are going to require a robust and muscular agency to manage what may be challenging relationships in the future. So anyway, I am optimistic that we will do the right thing, as we have sometimes in our past done the right thing. And also look forward that we do the right thing by making what we find with the agency available to the world and making Canada the global water solutions country.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to send that question next to MA and ask you about this as well.
I think my biggest hope now is in the fact that the stakeholder consultations led to a direct engagement with Indigenous people, and that the commitment of the federal government was to carry over the information into the operation of the Canada Water Agency, and that the goal in that engagement was actually to identify relationships, knowledge systems, governance. And so it wasn't about just understanding freshwater challenges. It was actually about informing the mandate, the priorities, the different roles, and the structure of the agency. And so I take, I have great hope in that, in the sense that, hopefully that those conversations, that input that has been received, that continues to be received, is going to help set the priorities of the agency in ways that reflect some of the things that we've discussed today, including Indigenous rights and governance, and the respective Indigenous knowledge systems, and in very meaningful ways, and in ways that connect with the promise of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and this imperative of reconciliation that we've already talked about in this panel.
Thank you, Emma. And just for everyone who's listening, the consultation that we're discussing, it was done by the Environment and Climate Change Canada, and you can look up the report. It's called What We Heard. It's interesting. They talked about 3,000 Canadians and talked about what are the values and what are the hopes for the Canada Water Agency on a public level. So lastly, I'm going to send that to you, Corinne. We talked about vulnerability and resilience. And so are you hopeful that this is going to affect areas and nations that have probably traditionally been quite overlooked in terms of freshwater management?
I am hopeful. I think we have to be hopeful. COVID-19 has shown that we have tremendous capacity and ability to pivot, and to pivot rapidly. And as we're hearing here at COP26, there is an urgency around climate change, and every year that urgency becomes more and more imperative. And so, having said that, the way in which the Canada Water Agency is being established is providing the time and space to ensure innovation in design, in approach, in intentionality to engage with Indigenous nations in Canada, intentionality in terms of being able to engage across physical and social systems, to be able to look towards being a global leader, to think about inclusion, and to connect the sort of gender agendas, SDGs, disaster, the Sendai Declaration, to be able to pull these, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to pull these global and national elements together to focus on water as a valued substance in Canada, but also a substance that's under threat in Canada. And so you've heard from everybody the way in which we've demonstrated the different dimensions of the needs, the opportunities, and the benefits. And so to be able to coordinate and fill gaps and mitigate climate change impacts, I think we have to be hopeful, but we also have to keep our eye on it and make sure that this moves forward in the ways that we've discussed here today, and keep that intentionality and keep that urgency.
Thank you. And now I'm going to actually send everything to Ralph. And instead of asking you flat out if you are hopeful, I'd love if you can kind of conclude on what we've heard today as we come to a close, and just really reiterate again, why is this so important right now?
Okay, thank you. I'd like to thank all the other panelists for their excellent insights. I've learned a lot today, and I guess as you can gather from my age, I've been learning for a very long time. A bit over 30 years ago, I had the opportunity to co-chair something called the Resource Use and Management Subcommittee of the IPCC. That's a subcommittee made suggestions on a broad range of climate change adaptation options in the renewable resource sectors, including water. At that time, there was still a lot of uncertainty about the probable timing and the magnitude of future climate change impacts. So the subcommittee focused mainly on what we called at the time no regrets strategies. In other words, these are strategies that would better prepare us for climate change, but would also be useful or beneficial with or without climate change and such changes. I'd say that some, but not nearly enough, of these no regrets strategies have taken place. have been implemented in Canada and elsewhere. For example, there's been significant advances in science, water pricing, and other water conservation measures, improvements to some intergovernmental agreements and arrangements, and on non-structural approaches to flood damage reduction. To go fast forward 30 years to today, the jury's now in on most climate change impacts. In a very small number of very special circumstances, those impacts are smaller than what we expected. For example, impacts on water levels of the Great Lakes are much less than we expected. In those few special circumstances, it's a very good thing that we didn't overreact and did use the no regrets policies. We could have overreacted with expensive, non-productive, and perhaps very even highly damaging measures. But those examples are few and far between. In the vast majority of circumstances, as John has outlined, the impacts have been far greater than anticipated. We can now say with considerable certainty the water supply is increasingly erratic, water quality is degrading in many places, extreme weather events are increasing in both frequency and severity, climate change is adding to or exacerbating many existing threats to our waters caused by pollution, overuse, habitat loss, alteration of flow, loss of biodiversity, and the introduction of invasive species. Maintaining the status quo will not only imperil the wealth and health of freshwater resources for Canadians who rely on them and their ecosystems, it will also cost Canadians and their governments untold billions of dollars. Changing course will require fundamentally rethinking the way we manage and govern freshwaters all across the country. This has to be a collaborative effort that engages all Canadians, involves all orders of government. The federal government has a critical role to play in leading this transformation. We have to both continue the best of the no regret strategies of the past and move well beyond them. Fortunately, this appears to have been recognized by the current government of Canada. 2 years ago, the federal government committed to establishing a new Canada Water Agency and spent the past 2 years, as others have mentioned, consulting broadly with Canadians. It's since committed to having the agency in place during 2022. The non-governmental water sector has applauded these commitments and has made numerous suggestions to the government, some solicited, some unsolicited. There's now a relatively broad consensus across the non-governmental sector on desirable characteristics of the new agency. More than 50 separate organizations came together recently to propose the fundamental pillars of the proposed water agency. These were shown on Emily's initial slide. First, the agency must meaningfully advance the federal government's commitment to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. Working towards reconciliation must be done in partnership with Indigenous people and therefore may look differently at different places across the country. Second, the Canada Water Agency must play a lead role in creating and mobilizing the knowledge needed to protect and respond to water problems and opportunities. This should include coordinating a central repository of information and ensuring that decision makers at all levels have the knowledge and tools they need to make responsible decisions. Third, the agency needs to enhance cooperative federalism in water management. That cooperative federalism must enhance and respect the provincial jurisdictions, Indigenous and municipal governments by providing high-level coordination and capacity support to these jurisdictions. Fourth, the Canada Water Agency must develop and catalyze a pan-Canadian strategy for water governance according to watershed boundaries. This must include strategies for realigning water management capacities across the federal government and a roadmap for watershed-based collaboration between jurisdictions. And fifth, the agency must bring about deep reform by addressing badly outdated federal water policies and laws, both to ensure coherence across the federal government and to better coordinate and cooperate with other orders of government. The non-governmental sector stands ready to advise and assist in the establishment of the Canada Water Agency and with the transformations needed to meet the very significant challenges facing water managers right across the country. The time to move forward is now, and it is critical not only to get it done, but to get it done right. Just say a few words about whether I'm optimistic or not. I think I represent flow in Canada. There's also a flow in the United States. That flow recently made the proclamation that the climate crisis is the water crisis. The climate crisis is the water crisis. And The non-governmental sector is very is pressing it. The government seems to recognize it. Canadians, 80% of Canadians think water is their most precious resource. Whenever anybody mentions something like water export, 80% of Canadians are up in arms. Canadians care. And I think because Canadians care, I think it will happen or has to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph. So I want to thank everyone for coming today, but I really want to emphasize that the climate crisis is the water crisis, and that going back to what John said as well, that Canada is worried. And if Canada is worried, the world should really be worried. But I want everyone in this global audience to see that we have 5 leaders with us here right now who are very hopeful, optimistic, and driven to make changes in freshwater management across the board. We can see there are many changes that need to be made and many issues that need to address and big questions to answer. But I'm very confident moving forward, knowing that such leaders as yourselves exist and are working so hard in this realm. So again, I want to say thank you to Dr. M.A. Kraft from the University of Ottawa, Dr. Corinne Schuster-Wallace from Global Water Futures and the University of Saskatchewan, Dr. John Pomeroy from Global Water Futures, Ralph Pentland, and Dr. Lauren Touchant from the Center on Governance. Thank you for joining me today. To the world, I hope that you also leave with a bit of hope today and know to look towards Canada, because big things are happening soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.